Good morning. We have a great session for you this morning. We have 3 presentations, so I'm very glad you're all here. There's lots of seats up front if anybody wants to move up. My name is Karen Bosworth. I'm with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. My pronouns are she, her. And I am mainly responsible, or the main body of my work is with the Homelessness Learning Hub. So hope you all get a chance to visit that site for professional development resources. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The conference is being held on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. The peoples of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory since time immemorial. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We acknowledge and celebrate the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from coast to coast to coast who participate in this conference and lead the work to end homelessness across Turtle Island. So our first presentation, our first presenters, I'll let them introduce themselves, but we have Anne-Marie Perron and Chloe Halpenny from Social Research and Demonstration Corporation. Give them a warm welcome, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you everyone for being here today and for choosing this session. We know you have lots of great choices. My name is Chloe Halpenny. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll allow my colleague Anne-Marie to introduce herself in a few moments. But as Karen mentioned, we are from the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation, or SRDC. I'm actually here wearing a couple different hats today. The first one is as a CAH board member. I'm really happy to be at my 3rd conference as a board member, this time in my home city and area on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm also a PhD candidate and instructor at Queen's University, where I research and teach on poverty and income insecurity. But the most important and most relevant thing that brings me here today is as my work with SRDC as a research associate, where we've been involved in a small but growing portfolio of research on the experiences and outcomes of queer and trans folks, previously youth, and now looking at adults in housing and homelessness. One more important thing about me that is relevant for this presentation is that I am a bisexual, and I feel like I should tell you all that. So so SRDC, for those of you who don't know, we're based here in Ottawa. We have offices in Ottawa and Vancouver, but are located around the country. We've been around for about 30 years, and we're a social policy research and evaluation organization that conducts research as well as works with partners working in housing, education, employment, and skills to help them learn a little bit more about their programs, what's working well, what maybe could be improved upon. But really, all of our work is mission-driven and dedicated to creating evidence that works to improve the lives of folks who are most disadvantaged and most disenfranchised. So that's a little bit of background, but today we will be focusing primarily on that growing body of work around queer and trans folks in housing. And as Karen mentioned, and I will reiterate, we are settlers. Anne-Marie and I are settlers, and we're primarily settler research team, and want to respectfully acknowledge that the land we're gathering on today is the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Maybe a little bit of additional context just of relevance for this project. So it is worth emphasizing, for those who don't know, I'm using the acronym of 2SLGBTQ+ throughout this presentation, but it should be noted that Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer youth disproportionately and uniquely experience poor housing and housing outcomes and experience homelessness, and are really uniquely affected by those intersecting systems of poverty, colonialism, homo, bi, and transphobia, and racism. So we are speaking sort of more broadly about the 2SLGBTQ+ folks, but I would really encourage people to go and seek out resources that sort of look specifically at the experiences of Indigenous youth in this space, because they are different and we are not purporting to speak on behalf of or for them. Although we were very lucky to have input from Two-Spirit folks through the literature review as well as part of our data collection. So I will start by giving a little bit of background of this project and sort of the previous iteration of it that led to the work that we're doing now, and then we'll turn it over to Anne-Marie to really dive in a little bit more to the ongoing piece of work that we've been involved in for the past year or so. So first, a little bit more background on our current project that we're working on. So there is a small but growing evidence base of housing inequities experienced by 2S LGBTQ+ adults, particularly in terms of qualifying for mortgages, unaffordable market rates, as well as employment and income insecurity. Unique barriers and facilitators exist in different contexts, with some having, for instance, more queer and trans-focused housing and adjacent supports, like tailored resources or programs and services, and some less. So the title of the project now is Queer Identity and Housing, Co-Designing Holistic Housing Access with 2S LGBTQ+ Adults in Canada. We're doing this work in partnership with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, working quite closely with John Ecker, who we're very lucky is here today, as well as Mentor Canada, funded by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. It's a 2-year project ending in March 2025, with the goal of making recommendations about how to best ensure more queer and trans folks can access the holistic supports to thrive in housing throughout their lives. So through this, we're conducting a comparative case study to explore facilitators and barriers to queer and trans adults accessing appropriate, adequate housing across the life course from emerging adulthood to old age. And we're doing this in partnership with an advisory reference group, which I think Anne-Marie will speak about a little bit more. So just to go back a little bit, this work initially started a couple of years ago, I guess more than a couple, 2020, but the past few years just all merged together, I think many of us appreciate. But this ongoing project follows a similar piece of work that SRDC did with the same partners and funders from 2020 to 2022, which really sought to dive deeper into the housing journeys and experiences of queer and trans youth and young people. The findings from that project highlighted queer and trans youth's experiences of housing precarity and sought to map their journeys across housing and housing services, particularly in that sort of transitioning out of homelessness phase and what was happening for folks when they were able to access more appropriate, more affordable, more accessible housing options. What were the things that really helped them get there? What were the barriers that they experienced? And again, specifically looking at that transitioning out of homelessness. We conducted a literature review, did an environmental scan, as well as interviews and workshops with 2S LGBTQ+ youth with former experiences of housing precarity or homelessness, as well as service providers who were involved in providing population-specific supports or housing services. I will not go into too many details about the findings for that project because it is done and all of the findings are online. And if you don't have a really cute little business card with the QR code that Anne-Marie made in front of you, we can give some to you after, but we've got a QR code linking to a bunch of stuff, including the findings from this past project, but we'll just share a couple highlights. So this is one of the many infographics that came out of it, because we love an infographic, that was really looking at designing and prototyping a queer-centered housing continuum, sort of starting from CMHC's housing continuum, looking at different types of housing. And with young folks as well as service providers, we really looked at that and said, okay, how much does this represent what's really going on for queer and trans youth? And the answer, probably unsurprisingly to many of you, was not at all, really. We found that the traditional housing continuum model really obscured the complexity of queer and trans youth journeys, and may in fact actually serve to further marginalize their experiences. So we found found that queer and trans youth had a lot of transience and movement between different housing types, sort of cycling in and moving back and forth between different housing experiences and stages. We heard a lot about trade-offs that people were making in terms of, trading off safety for affordability, or, making really difficult decisions in terms of, I can't really afford to live alone, but I'm really nervous about living with roommates who might actually be transphobic or homophobic, because people had that experience before, but obviously affording a one-bedroom apartment can be really, really challenging. So relatedly, many saw market ownership as aspirational rather than an attainable goal. This prototype, which is the text here is quite small. I don't know how much folks will be able to read, but this is all part of the report, and I'd invite folks to look into that further. Another infographic that came from that project, one of the things that we wanted to look at was understanding people's experiences in independent rental housing. So relatively, we know that there's more research on the experiences and journeys of queer and trans youth experiencing homelessness, but we wanted to get a sense again of what happens after when folks are able to find a market rental, for instance. What are the things that help them get there, and what were the barriers specifically for queer and trans youth? So there we heard about things like Facebook groups where queer folks were sort of pulse checking landlords, and had created these really cool community-oriented collective spaces through informal channels to be able to gauge whether people were safe, whether that was a safe place to rent, a safe place to go. And on the other hand, we heard a lot about sort of challenges navigating the rental market as a queer or trans person, specifically a young person who might lack more of some of those access to formal supports, but also may not have as well established of a support network, may not have connections to natural supports, and again, struggling with homo, bi, transphobia on the part of potential roommates as well as landlords. One of the really cool outcomes that came from this project, which we'll shout out to the moderator now. I had the chance to work closely with Karen and folks at the COH. Most you guys did all the work. I just had the chance to look at some drafts and say that this is really cool. But the COH developed an online training that is free, that sort of drew from some of the findings from this original project on creating safe and inclusive housing solutions for 2SLGBTQ plus youth, targeted to service providers. And that's relatively recently newly available online and something we're really excited about. So all of this leads us to the current project, which seeks to sort of understand some of these questions a little bit more, but in the context of adults who have received also scant attention in the research and policy spaces compared to queer and trans youth. So some of the things that we've done so far as part of this project, following sort of a similar pathway to the Youth Focus project, we started with a literature review of homelessness and housing insecurity among 2SLGBTQ plus adults. We also conducted initial key informant interviews with 16 folks across Canada, and that included people with lived experience of being unhoused or identifying as 2SLGBTQ, researchers in the field, service providers, as well as policymakers. And with these folks, we really sort of got a pulse check on, are we asking the right research questions? Are we using the right methods? How does the general approach to what we want to do here, how is this landing with you? And got some really valuable feedback on some of those things. We also asked about plans for an advisory or reference group and what might some of the best ways to engage people over the course of the project be. So that leads us to some of the unique housing challenges experienced by 2SLGBTQ plus adults in Canada that came out of the literature review and key informant interview stage. I, again, won't spend too long here since a lot of this reflects things that other folks working in this space have been saying for a while, but things like how the gender binary operates throughout much of the sector and the ongoing reliance of that within shelter contexts, for instance. We read and heard about the ongoing role and impact of gender and sexuality-based discrimination in affecting people's experiences. We heard about sort of this, really survival-based focus and look at people, pursuing safety and acceptance and community, really in the face of intolerance, hostility, and violence. We again heard about sort of the frequency of transitions and some of these distinct challenges in the rental market related to rising rent evictions, and discrimination from landlords, neighbors, roommates. And now I think I will turn it over to Anne-Marie.
Perfect. Thank you, Chloe, and thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Anne-Marie, and I use she and her pronouns. I identify as queer, cisgender, and also a white settler of French ancestry. So Chloe got us started as to what we've done so far, so I'll just continue on that track. So our second step was selecting communities for a comparative case study using a phase systems mapping. Really, what that means is that we've done an environmental scan on different communities in Canada to, okay, like what are the communities we want to focus for this case study. And so to do that, we kind of generated a list of factors that were likely to influence the housing inequities experienced by 2SLGBTQ plus adults in any given community. So factors such as, is there existing research that has been done in that community around housing, homelessness, and 2SLGBTQ plus well-being? Also factors such as, is there a housing strategy being established in that community? What's the availability and ease of access to local supports? What's the visibility and strength of the queer community in that locality? And also practical considerations for fieldwork. So do we have existing knowledge of the community? Do we have existing networks and connections? So we first started with 6 communities across Canada, did an environmental scan on those communities, and then did a phase approach. So did a further environmental scan on 3 communities that were Ottawa, Saskatoon, and Halifax. And we finally landed on a comparative case study between Saskatoon and Halifax. Just quick highlights from these 2 communities. The environmental scans are quite extensive, but just a few highlights. In terms of Saskatoon, what was interesting in this community is that there is one of the only supported independent living home for queer and trans youth called the Pride Home that services queer and trans youth aged 16 to 21. So what's interesting in this case is really understanding, okay, what comes next after these youth age out of those services, are early adult, or in their early adulthood, what happens next? There's also a particular social and political context right now in Saskatchewan. I'm sure it's not news to all of you, with the recent Bill 137, which means that schools now have to are now required to obtain parental consent if a student under 16 changes their pronouns or names at school. So just a particular context where allies, activists, and advocates are really trying to fight for the rights of queer and trans youth in those communities. Now, Halifax has a particular rental market that is quite at strain. There's a lack of housing stock that is a growing problem in Halifax, a vacancy rate that is only 1% since 2019, so really the second lowest in the country. And as well, we know that Halifax was the second most gender diverse city in Canada, following Victoria. So that community represented particular strain on the rental market, but also a thriving community as well. So those are just a few key elements from the environmental scan from these two communities. I'll just pass this quickly, but after we chose our two communities of focus, we developed our study instruments and also applied for ethics to start working on the study. And part of that was also coming back to our reference group that Chloe mentioned, that was composed of folks with lived experience, again, also researchers, housing stakeholders, folks on the front line, and really kind of seeing are our protocols making sense? Are we asking the right questions? The language, is the language okay and aligned with the values of the communities? So we did that first before conducting any interviews. So after we received approval from ethics, we then started our interviews in August of this year, so still really recent. And so we conducted our interviews in Halifax, and we're still conducting interviews in Saskatoon. So if you know anyone in Saskatoon who may be interested to partake in the research, the little handout that some of you have and maybe some of you don't have yet includes our recruitment posters, the screening survey that people can come to if they're interested. But what we've done also, given a little bit of the challenges that we have in Saskatoon, is expand our research to the whole Saskatchewan province. So this is something we're kind of revising as we go. But the interviews conducted so far really yield rich and in-depth discussions on the intersections of housing and queer identity, and really drawing from a broad range of individuals with diverse lived experience. So I got a note that there's still 2 minutes, so I'll make it quick for the last few slides. But just one thing we wanted to share is that one method that we're using for the interviews is a photo elicitation interviewing method. So using photos to generate conversation and also align with sometimes the themes that we're discussing, but sometimes a bit more abstract. So it's a method that we're using for these interviews with 2SLGBTQ plus adults. Here are our recruitment posters, but also a link in the link tree that you have on the handout. Those can be widely shared if you or anyone you know is interested to partake. One of the things we also did with this research is set up an online activity where folks are invited to submit either a written submission, a media submission, to the response, what thriving in housing means for you. So we received quite a lot of responses, drawings, pictures, poems in some cases. So that Padlet is also available to you with the link as well. As you've heard, we're still really in the gist of conducting that research. There's a few early themes that we can that have emerged, especially from our interviews in Halifax. Those early themes are that supporting each other through queer and trans communities is vital. Taking care of each other is something we hear a lot, whether through mutual aid, organizing, crowdfunding for folks who've maybe recently lost their housing. There's still some barriers within the 2SLGBTQ plus community, especially for newcomers, trans, racialized queer individuals. So within community, barriers are still present. Housing supports are accessed through informal networks, as Chloe mentioned, from the Youth Project, so sometimes from queer Facebook groups. And housing challenges are even more pronounced when intersecting identities, such as living with a disability, living in poverty, being unemployed, or being non-binary or trans are present. So really multiplying the obstacles queer and trans folks face. Ultimately, interviewees emphasized that systemic changes, such as decommodifying housing, were essential for achieving meaningful improvement in the housing landscape. And some of those solutions that were mentioned was advocating for rent control, universal basic income, increased transparency. So really actively seeking information around accessibility from landlords, accessibility of their rental, and other policy reforms as well. So I'll finish here, but our next step is also engaging in journey mapping exercises and workshops in each of the communities that we're looking at. And so we're expecting to do that once our interviews are all done. And so we really want to do some kind of visualizing, what are the solutions, what are the prototypes that we can think of. And finally, our last stage will be knowledge translation activities. So we want to produce bilingual guides for different knowledge user groups. And so this is something we're hoping to do. And so we'll leave it at a few questions for you. I know we're at time, so we may come back to those in the Q&A portion, but we're really curious to hear from folks what are the specific information resources that would help address the unique housing needs of queer and trans individuals. So what would those knowledge products would contain? What kind of information resources, but also what are the formats and materials that you'd be looking at, be it reports, guides, toolkits that would be most effective in supporting your work. So I'll leave it at those questions. If anyone has anything they want to share around those, we'd be really curious to hear from you. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you at the end. We'll have our Q&A session at the end. You know how this goes. So I'll just give our next presenters a chance to get up to the stage, and let me see if I can figure this out. So our next presenters are Sarah Stouffer-Lerch and Zaina Gopal. Give them a nice welcome.
Hello, my name is Sarah, and today we're going to be presenting on lessons from tailored sites, improving programs and services for 2S LGBTQ plus adults in the homelessness and housing sector. And today I'm presenting with Zaina, and just to situate myself to the important work that's being done, I identify as a Black American, and I also identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community. So first, I'll go over the research project that I did last year that informs this presentation. Then I'll move on to defining what exactly we mean when we refer to tailored housing services. Next, Zaina will discuss her and her colleagues' important work at Loft Community Services and share just one way that tailored housing can manifest and what it can look like. And finally, we'll wrap up with some recommendations that may be applicable to the programs and services and contexts that everyone here comes from. So first, I just want to start with some general foundational information on 2S LGBTQ plus homelessness. First, we know that 2S LGBTQ plus folks are disproportionately represented among those who experience homelessness. In Toronto, where our study took place, 6% of the general population identifies as members of the queer community, but among the unhoused population, that percentage is is about 10 to 12%, so about a two-fold increase there. And these numbers are, again, likely to be underestimates given the prevalence of stigma, as well as the reticence to disclose sexual orientation and or gender identity information in surveys. And so when thinking about this disparity, the reasons for this are many and include reasons that are common to the general unhoused population, such as lack of income, job loss, or rent increases beyond what people can reasonably afford. But there are also reasons, of course, that are deeply connected to their identity as a member of the queer or trans community. Oops. And these reasons include discrimination, familial rejection, as well as discrimination on the private market. And we know that transgender people, for instance, especially report being denied housing either explicitly through language or behaviors of landlords, but also given quiet rejections from landlords who just never respond to rental inquiries once they learn that a potential tenant is a member of the trans community. But this discrimination, it persists in the homelessness and housing sector, as we know, which is why the lack of services pertaining to the 2SLGBTQ plus community is of such concern. For instance, in Toronto, again, when my study took place, the city operates 49 emergency shelters. However, only 2 of them are specific to the 2SLGBTQ plus community. And because of the discrimination that I mentioned that these individuals face in services for the general population, these individuals often avoid emergency shelters altogether. And this puts them at further risk for violence, exposure to the elements, and also just prolongs their time that could be spent receiving the support that they so desperately need. And so having these services that are tailored to this community is critical, which we'll discuss in further detail throughout this presentation. So based on the challenges that I outlined, I conducted a study last year from September to April on the experiences of 2SLGBTQ plus adults in Toronto's homelessness and housing support system. And so when we were conceiving of the project, we initially had 2 overarching research objectives. And so the first objective was to understand the experiences of adults 24 years and up who identify as members of the 2S LGBTQ plus community who are currently experiencing or had experienced housing instability. So there's already a growing literature base, an existing literature base on 2S LGBTQ plus youth homelessness. And so for our study, we chose to only recruit participants who were 24 years or older because we wanted to really hear from individuals who had transitioned from the youth sector into the adult sector or were going through that process. We also wanted to hear from middle-aged adults and older adults, as well as those who are less represented in the previous research, and gain a deeper understanding along the life continuum. Our second overarching objective initially was to understand the challenges that housing support programs may have while they try to provide the services to their clients, especially within the context of serving the 2S LGBTQ plus adult community. However, as we kind of finalized our recruitment strategies, we ended up partnering with organizations that specifically target the unhoused 2S LGBTQ plus adult community or work very closely within that community. And so with that in mind, we added 2 additional objectives. And these 2 additional objectives were first, to understand the perceptions that unhoused 2S LGBTQ plus adults have of tailored sites versus sites for the general population. And so thinking about the mechanisms by which tailored sites operate from the client perspective and how that compares and contrasts to what they're experiencing at those general services. And the second objective that we added was to understand the unique needs, experiences, and stressors of staff members at tailored sites who also identify as members of the 2S LGBTQ plus community. We wanted to really more deeply understand how having that insider status is acting upon staff members' perceptions of their dual role as peers and staff members. And so to answer these questions, I conducted an exploratory qualitative study in Toronto under the auspices of the MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions. I conducted 23 semi-structured interviews. 20 of them were done with 2S LGBTQ plus identifying clients from the 4 community services that we worked with in Toronto. And 3 of the interviews were conducted with staff members who identify as 2S LGBTQ plus from those services. And at the outset of this work, I consulted with the MAPS Center's Community Expert Group, and this is a working group of individuals with lived experiences of homelessness who work with projects pertaining to the unhoused community, and they helped ensure that the methods and protocols and procedures that I was using were informed by those with lived experiences. And so next, I'll move on to what we mean when we talk about tailored housing. So from a very high-level perspective, tailored housing is housing services that really meet the demands and needs of population-based needs. In this case, the specific needs of the 2SLGBTQ plus adult community. We recognize that not all communities have the resources to create dedicated services for specific populations. But we think it's important to recognize the added challenges that certain communities have, which is what this conceptual model of tailored thinking is kind of getting at. So tailored thinking posits that tailoring can be more of a mindset rather than a mandate. And this mindset can permeate a service at the client level, the staff level, as well as across the entire organization. So at the client level, tailored thinking challenges organizations and their personnel to kind of critically recognize intersectional approaches to care, as well as understanding, and this mindset can permeate the service at the client level, the staff level, and across the entire organization. So at the client level, tailored thinking challenges organizations to critically recognize intersectional approaches to care and understand the sociocultural nuances of their client base. And so at the staff level, it is crucial to encourage staff to build a culture of allyship and for staff to support folks who identify as 2SLGBTQ+, not just at the point of hiring, but also along the entire hiring continuum. And finally, at the organizational level, considering creating and sustaining trust and safety, which starts at the top leadership level. And so with this tailored thinking approach, we believe that even the most resource-strapped organization or community context can really apply the ideas and tenets of population-based housing to guide the behaviors and actions and philosophies of clients, staff, and organizations. So first, I just want to touch on why tailored sites are critical and provide some further detail based on what participants spoke to in my study. So one of the key themes that kind of cropped up was the importance of mental and emotional safety. So clients felt welcomed, they felt supported, they felt accepted, and they felt this way unconditionally at these spaces, which I think the first quote really demonstrates. And because they felt unconditionally supported, clients shared that these spaces gave them kind of a space to heal. So one client shared with me that after transferring from a general site to a tailored service, he felt that he could resume what he called his healing journey, which he felt had been on pause at the previous location that he was at. And because clients are able to heal and find respite from previous traumatic challenges, they found themselves able to ask for help. And so one thing people mentioned a lot in my research was that when they were homeless, independence and self-reliance were necessary components to their survival. And so recognizing that staff were there to actually help and genuinely cared about their well-being helped them be able to unlearn some of these coping strategies and relinquish these emotional barriers that they had built up. And then a second theme that emerged from the research was the benefit of having similarly identifying clients and personnel. So clients spoke to the importance of having other 2SLGBTQ+ clients they could speak to and relate to. They really appreciated that they felt they didn't have to choose to kind of come out over and over again to their peers, and they could just jump right into conversations and not have to provide context or background related to their identity. At the same time, identity was not necessarily tied to gender and or sexuality. Some spoke about having similar mental health journeys, and this too provided opportunities for connection. And clients also appreciated having staff members who identified as members of the community. So seeing and working with people who they felt were like them in many ways gave many participants a sense of hope and inspiration. And so for clients with chronic suicidality, the presence of having 2SLGBTQ+ staff gave them a reason to persevere and push forward. And so all of this feeds into the holistic benefit of being surrounded by people with shared identities and shared experiences, which created, as I've alluded to, a sense of belonging. Although this wasn't a panacea to all the other challenges that come with being homeless, it also just made it a bit easier to kind of persevere. clients shared that they weren't feeling a constant sense of hypervigilance about who in the shelter they could or could not tell about their identity. So next I'll pass it on to Zaina to kind of talk about her and her colleagues' work at Loft Community Services.
Right. Hi, good morning. So my name is Zaina Gopal. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Director of Supportive Housing Services at Loft. I'm here to share some of our experiences operating what we believe is Toronto's and potentially Canada's only supportive housing building specifically for trans adults. And we know there are some services for youth in the sector, but really have seen there's a major gap where it comes to adult services. So Loft is a multi-service organization serving Toronto, York Region, and Simcoe, Muskoka. We have 3 streams of services. We do complex personal care services, specialized community services, and then supportive housing. And so we're no strangers to tailored sites. We're definitely not the experts where it comes to trans housing, but we've really seen this as an important gap to fill. And so we're hoping to share some of our learnings in hopes that this inspires others to take up this work as well. And I do want to be also just clarify that when we use the word trans, we're using it as an umbrella term for transgender, two-spirited, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks. So just a brief overview of our housing sites over here. This initiative started in 2017 as the Bloom program, and this actually came out of our HIV and AIDS programming at MacEwan Housing and Support Services. That's been in operation for over 30 years. So through this program, we were finding a disproportionate number of trans-identified individuals who were facing significant challenges with stigma, lack of safety, discrimination, and ultimately no safe place to live. So we opened our Riverdale site first. This is a 5-person cooperative house, so it's a shared accommodation. We have case management that will come on site as well as life enrichment activities. And we just moved this year to permanent housing in that space in response to understanding that many of our folks there were not able to move on to other safe spaces as it was transitional in the past. We also have a high support housing site in West Toronto, so our Spencer site. This was started in 2018. We've moved up to 18 units in that building as of 2021. Clients have self-contained units there, but share common areas. And this is a 24/7 staffed space. And so we do deal with complex mental health challenges there, substance use challenges, and really offering a whole suite of supports for people. So Loft's approach to client care is part of how we are able to do some of this tailored work. You'll see that we are quite aligned with healthcare services, and we do consider ourselves a healthcare organization. So that's been a big part of our work in serving this community. And I want to just dive a little bit closer into our supportive housing. So we have an integrative approach, and this has really been the key to our success, and is particularly important, I think, in being able to offer these tailored approaches. We know that trans folks have experienced so much trauma at the hands of social services and healthcare, and so it's very important for us to have as much as possible provided in one space. And so in addition to that trust building, we also find we can provide much higher support and work at a much higher intensity when we use an integrative wraparound model. So we have residential supports available at all of our sites, and particularly at Spencer. It's been important to have people available at any time to really meet people where they're at. And we take a team approach. So while we have caseloads, we really work together as a team to support every individual within our housing. I think our intensive case management, I won't go into depth because I know lots of folks in housing over here, but the life enrichment I want to just speak about briefly. This has really been kind of our secret sauce in housing and bringing things together. And really for us, this is kind of walking the talk of being very community focused and focusing on those principles of belonging, allowing people to flourish and really be celebrated as their true and authentic selves. We do a lot around skill building, one-to-one supports, and we try to focus on instrumental activities of daily living to help people kind of move toward on the recovery continuum towards independence. For us, harm reduction also is very, very important, recognizing the behaviors that are driven by substance use and responding accordingly. really recognizing trauma-informed practices and building trust with folks, and going beyond substance use when we talk about harm reduction. We've noted, working with this population, very high instances of, for instance, of self-harm and eating disorders, and it's important that we continue to use that same judgment-free approach and harm reduction principles, removing the shame so people can really focus on recovery in these spaces. And then finally, eviction prevention for us always starts at day one, not just when things are becoming an issue. So we create safety plans with folks. We have creative approaches to building comfort with people, really operate on a model of mutual respect. And when we're hitting a wall with someone, rather than assuming that they can't meet our standards, we're going then to consult with trauma specialists to see how we can better adapt. So I'll talk a little bit about our program impact here. The Bloom program also brought around the Bloom Network, which has been a community of practice for providers within Toronto who are providing services to the trans community. We've had 48 trans and non-binary folks come through our doors since 2017 between the two programs, 26 of whom have been referred to gender-affirming primary care services. Some of the people coming through to us are very new to services altogether and may not have primary care. For a number of these, though, they have had primary care providers who were either reticent to provide support, citing unfamiliarity with trans health issues, or they were being discriminatory in their practice, and so we've had to be able to move people on to partner primary care providers. We've also hired 14 trans and non-binary staff in our Spencer and Riverdale sites, so that's just shy of about 50% of our staff at these sites, 4 of whom have been in or are currently in leadership positions. And finally, we found partway through this program that we really were having trouble having appropriate therapeutic services for our clients. And so to date, we've spent about $25,000 on specialized therapeutic services. Essentially, every time we get unrestricted funding, this is what we put it towards, but making sure that the folks we serve aren't facing wait lists and they have queer providers to support them. So I'm going to go quickly through our lessons learned here. So in terms of client support, the case management, of course, requires very unique skills. There's very little in our sector that's around trans health issues, and so we've really had to specialize there and support our staff in learning. And there's a huge space for advocacy in doing this work. I think the biggest thing is the trauma-informed piece, and I really can't understate this. It's going to manifest very differently for folks coming through, and there's a lot of trust to be built also with the service provider. I think for us, it's really important that we're asking the right questions rather than wondering why people can't meet our guidelines, and really truly believing that it's our job to build trust with our clients, and it's not their job to do that. I think the other piece too, and kind of pointing to the research, is that our tailored programs require constant reviews of evidence-informed approaches. We refer to resources such as the World Professional Association of Trans Health, and as well as working with a number of researchers, I think in the Toronto area. And that we've really found we need to kind of change the way we provide services so that our conventional housing guidelines don't always work for our clients. An example being that, for instance, in supportive housing at Loft, there is a ban on our internet on all pornographic material. And that has been a challenge for a number of our clients. So we've had to make exceptions there, work with kind of our IT department as well, and thinking as well about kind of justice and safety for sex workers. So there's been a lot of changes, I think, also to how we run these programs. Around staff, and I know I'm a bit short on time, so I'll go quickly here, but again, working with trans-identified staff it's been really important to think about that trust building, to recognize the trauma that's come from other employers. And there's a lot of protectiveness also, of course, and it's very difficult, and we recognize this, for trans folks to see other members in their communities who are really, really struggling. And so having adequate supports in place for staff has been incredibly important, recognizing where there's space for re-traumatization, making sure that we're using trans consultants, and also recognizing where sometimes our management isn't always the best person to talk to, and so needing to kind of step back and mediate that way too. So these are just very kind of concrete ways that we've adapted our program based on the learnings that we've had to be a tailored service. So again, using those unrestricted funding to provide therapeutic services that we wouldn't normally have access to in our programs, having client funds for things like ID changes and gender affirming surgeries, and building those networks with gender affirming health practitioners and folks who are particularly trans affirming. Really highlighting community building and creating a welcoming space, knowing that folks often will experience a lot of transphobia the moment they step out the door. And so it's so important to have that safe space and community. And then with our workforce, also making sure that we have mandatory training for all of our staff, no matter how they identify, using consultants appropriately, and really focusing on that justice-oriented leadership for all. So we're going to move to our recommendations. I have one slide here just around our recommendations as a community provider. For the sector, of course, and we've heard this, I think, across the board, there are not enough services for 2SLGBTQ plus populations, particularly for adults. And as we look at those services, it's important to diversify and think about kind of what comes next for those youth who are leaving specialized housing. Those are many of our referrals are folks who are aging out of youth services. For service providers, making sure that there's actual readiness to provide that tailored housing, being ready to listen, being ready to change your approaches, and really prioritizing trauma-informed approaches, not just for clients, but for staff as well. So I'll just pass it back to Sarah for our final wrap-up here.
So I'll just close up with some recommendations based on the research. So from a client perspective, a lot of times we want to think about utilizing intersectional approaches to care. So what that looks like is maybe thinking about the added challenges that kind of ride along with homelessness, such as like that loneliness and isolation piece, and the way that mental health concerns and trauma impact those heavy emotions. And so addressing those concerns could kind of look like developing structured activities to build connections and community within sites. But also when we're thinking about intersectionality, I really think it's important to kind of note that we embody all of ourselves at every moment simultaneously, and 2S LGBTQ plus clients may also still be facing ageism or racism or other forms of stigmatization, even at a site that is tailored to the 2S plus community. Which is why I think it is so crucial to kind of understand the sociocultural nuances within client populations. So one thing that kind of cropped up in the study was the way that this manifested through the immigrant experience, as many of our participants were recent immigrants. And I just want to highlight two major themes for this group, and I'll kind of go through these quickly, but kind of just the unique sense of isolation related to them being recent immigrants, as well as the challenge of finding accepting community spaces upon landing in Canada. So one recurring issue with that was that many recent immigrants are escaping discrimination in their country of origin. And so for many non-immigrant clients, finding those cultural spaces is a great way to mitigate loneliness and isolation. But for 2S plus immigrants, those cultural spaces could and sometimes had the same kind of harmful dynamics that forced them to leave their country in the first place. So as an organization, it was really critical to consider whether connecting those individuals to cultural groups would help or harm them. And then for staff, just thinking about building a culture of allyship and empowering staff to act on methods to be good allies. And then again, supporting 2S LGBTQ plus staff along the hiring continuum. And then lastly, at an organizational level, creating a culture of creating and sustaining trust and safety. So staff kind of spoke to the way that they are going about creating an organization-wide culture in which there's kind of a baseline level of understanding with agencies and all partnering organizations. And they do this through mandatory training that everyone must complete prior to working with them at any capacity. And they also kind of discuss just embedding cultural humility and recognition of community-specific needs in the actual organizational processes that they use. And I'll kind of cut it there, just in the interest of time. But I just kind of want to close with the idea that kind of collectively, when you think about this idea, it kind of created, it creates a culture of inclusion and understanding that is all fed into a feedback loop that is informed by this tailored approach. And so focusing on client-specific needs kind of can feed into the actions and behaviors of staff, which informs the organization. that supports and expects mutual respect. And again, I just want to close with, we understand that, the social service sector, it doesn't always have the resources to implement some of these things, but it may not be feasible in certain community contexts. But we do hope that the ideas that tailored programs are guided by can be utilized to make the process of navigating homelessness kind of more compassionate and less scary for everyone involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Zaina. That was a great presentation. So now we have our final presenter. I'd like to introduce to you Julia Drydeck from the Center to End Human Trafficking. My apologies. I'm just trying to pull up your.
Hello, everyone, and we are pretty much completely shifting gears right now. So my name is Julia Drydeck, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Executive Director at the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. And while there are intersections, I do want to just acknowledge that this is a pivot from the last two amazing presentations. So a little bit about us. So it says it in our name. We're the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. Our mandate is to end all forms of human trafficking in Canada, and we largely see that through sexual exploitation and labor exploitation. So one of the key ways that we do this is in operating the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, which is a 24/7, 365 multilingual and confidential resource. It's available to anyone. So we've partnered with over 1,000 frontline service delivery partners across the country that provide close to 4,000 unique programs and services, so that ideally we're able to connect folks to services in their community when they call, if they are available. We're going to talk a little bit more about what we've learned through operating the hotline, but in addition to that, we also try to function as a backbone agency. So working on collective action through research, policy, advocacy, and sometimes just convening. Human trafficking usually is kind of set to be understood in terms of the far end of the spectrum of exploitation when other systems of social justice are completely collapsing. So it is kind of an extreme outcome of where you see all of these other parts of our social safety net and areas of inclusion kind of failing people. And I'll also just say really quickly what human trafficking is and what it is not. So this is not the movie Taken. This is not people being smuggled across borders. It's not having them be handcuffed to radiators for the most part. But we also, and I want to be clear, do not conflate this with consensual sex work, nor do we conflate it with circumstantial sex work. When we talk about human trafficking, we're talking about where there is a third party that is intentionally manipulating, coercing, controlling, and basically forcing someone to perform sexual acts for money for their own profit. So we usually see that this is taking place through a process of luring, grooming, isolation, and then manipulation and coercion and exploitation. Traffickers, no one identifies as a trafficking victim, and no one refers to their trafficker as their trafficker. It's their boyfriend, it's their friend, it's their family member. This is relational, and it's about people embedding themselves in a relational context, often starting with the process of identifying vulnerabilities. So this can be anything from low self-esteem, problems at home, problems at school, homelessness, housing insecurity, poverty, food insecurity. It then usually involves a process of love bombing. So finding out everything they can about this person, their greatest dreams and aspirations, their biggest fears, and then fulfilling those needs in their lives. So that can be material things like a place to stay. It can mean food. It can mean clothing and shelter. It can also often mean the promise of unconditional love. And then quickly starting to take that away, withholding it, and then using it as a tool to then coerce them into the commercial sex industry. And I want to say the difference here is that when we're in those experiences of exploitation, the individual being exploited has almost no choice. They've been isolated by their friends and family. There are threats being imposed on them. There's a huge amount of stigma and judgment that's placed on anyone who engages in commercial sex work, be it through choice or coercion. And often they have very little agency and control over when they sleep, when they eat, who they can spend time with, and also what types and how many sexual activities that they have to do every day. So when we're serving folks, their needs are very kind of specific, and within that context of kind of extreme trauma. So just a couple things at a high level. So we serve everyone across Canada. We do see that there's a larger proportion of callers to the hotline coming from Ontario, but we also have a higher population density, and we've got more per capita funding, specifically in human trafficking awareness and programs. So this all needs to be taken with a grain of salt. This is not incidence or prevalence data. This is really just outputs in terms of who is contacting the hotline. But I'll also say, and this is different to a lot of the dominant narratives that you will hear, law enforcement is not part of the primary solution at all of this. So when folks are calling the hotline, the number one service that they are requesting is for emergency shelter and housing. Because similar to other forms of intimate partner violence, which is how this is really manifesting, they're really looking to exit and to have that basic shelter and basic needs met. In our first year of operating the hotline, only about 6% of cases that contacted us, or people that identified as actual trafficking survivors, wanted anything to do with the cops. So I think that's our challenge right now too, is because we're seeing a chronically underfunded system and structure that's what folks actually need upon exiting, and we're throwing a ton of money into law enforcement, which number one isn't working. It's not accessible for folks that are exiting, and let's be honest, a lot of them hate the cops. So again, the number one referral that we're looking for is shelter when they're calling, followed by case management, supportive counseling, and then other things come from that as well. So again, it really is that, basic needs. And I also just want to say that in all of our work, we really do try to embed lived experience in absolutely everything that we do. So what we're going to be talking about right now is kind of a culmination of the policy and advocacy work that we've done in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. And through this, we're actually now developing coalitions with frontline service delivery partners and ensuring that there's ethically compensated lived experience as part of all of our work in designing all of these policy options and solutions. So we really do take that seriously. And then also looking quantitatively at what it is that we're putting out or what it is that we're needing through the hotline. So I think when we first were founded as an organization, when the hotline first launched in 2019, there was this idea that you could do like ethical research on people calling a crisis hotline in need of services, which is not ethical or even reliable. What we are looking at now is looking at our outputs, right? So really understanding through the hotline, not what are the unique circumstances of every person calling us, but what is it that they're actually needing and what are the barriers that they're experiencing. So when we get a call from someone with complex needs, and we're gonna go through that a little bit in terms of the types of services they're looking for, it will sometimes take us, and we've got a specialized national referral directory with direct relationships with partners that sometimes have human trafficking specific beds. We're sometimes doing 12 to 20 call outs in a single municipality. And even from there, there's not a single bed available, nothing that is appropriate. And we're often looking to actually arrange for transportation across jurisdictions to be able to meet their needs. So we're seeing the system around us collapse, and then similarly, individuals that don't fit into the box of generalized or mainstream services are ending up with almost no options. So when folks who have experienced this type of sexual exploitation contact us, again, they are impacted by an entire spectrum of public policy and services. So it's everything, again, you can read the list here, but it's from mental health and addiction, education, healthcare, immigration, employment, housing, social assistance. It runs everything. And y'all are probably very familiar also with the spectrum of housing, but the areas in red are specifically where we're finding folks that we're serving becoming trapped. So this is where they get stuck or where they're kind of falling through the cracks. So in the unsheltered and hidden homelessness space, that's often actually where the recruitment, the luring, and the grooming takes place, right? Like that's where they're looking, where traffickers are looking for folks where there's a need that can be filled and they can kind of start reinforcing that trauma bond. Again, a lot of this is very like psychological and emotional. It's an emergency shelter, transitional supportive housing, social and community housing, and affordable housing. Again, where we're not meeting their needs, where there's not an effective transition between the continuum. Again, like I once challenged the city of Toronto to try and reduce its emergency shelter occupancy down to 90%, and I think that scared the bejesus out of them because that means they actually have to build transitional housing. That the solution isn't just building more emergency shelters and keeping people in emergency shelters forever, but it's actually about creating like realistic, anyways, supportive long-term housing. But we're also finding that the emergency shelter system is not safe for folks exiting trafficking. So number one, there's very real security concerns for them. We know that there's also recruitment, luring, and grooming that's happening on site in shelters. The actual fifth stage of exploitation through sex trafficking is also recruitment. So often as a survival mechanism, but also to reduce the quotas that are put on them. Folks that are being sexually exploited are then coerced into recruiting others. And so we see that loop is taking place within the emergency shelter system. But I'll also say the amount of policing, oversight, and rules that happen in the general emergency shelter system either mimics or is worse than their trafficking situation, right? So if you're going from a situation where you're being surveyed, controlled, you have no autonomy, no choice, and then if you look at our generalized emergency shelter system, you're in that same position, you're not actually giving someone any better of an option. And you're actually forcing them to work harder and then kind of suck up to have their basic needs met in a way that they might not have had to do. I do want to recognize that there's a lot of attention being put on human trafficking right now. It's kind of the issue du jour. But I also want to say that the folks that we're serving, again, don't normally actually present as the deserving client that so many people need to present as to navigate the system, right? Like we have an emergency shelter system that kind of forces people to behave and perform a certain way to get the very meager amount of basic needs met. And as much as you hear about human trafficking as being, everyone gets what they need, that is not the case. And they do often present with really complex needs that are challenging to serve. And anyways. And then again, too, in transitional and supportive housing, there's just not enough out there. But again, the rules and the regulations and maintaining that sense of being able to not be evicted. We all know that there's horrifically long waits for social and community housing, so being able to find the right supports and to get someone in a place where they're ready to live on their own, but then where there's absolutely nothing available that's actually affordable is another issue. So that's kind of where we're struggling. And of course, private rental market and home ownership are their own beast, but we're really kind of focusing right now on policy areas around the red areas. So now a little bit into the more kind of concrete nitty-gritty issues and barriers that we're experiencing. And I think a lot of people agree with this with a bunch of folks that you're probably working with. It's not necessarily unique to trafficking survivors, But their experiences of these challenges can be unique, in some ways also because of the intense stigma and shame that's imposed on them, and how they're experiencing different forms of discrimination within the social services sector because of their previous engagement with the commercial sex industry. So one of the things we've probably all had to deal with is the fact that increasingly governments want to fund a specific niche program for a niche group that's going to look really good in an announcement and not base funding. And in Ontario, we have seen some really strong investments in anti-human trafficking, but the problem is that they then need to tell their story and to recount the most horrific things that have ever happened to them, that have been held against them for years, to be able to then get basic services. So again, it's incredibly traumatizing, it's intrusive, it doesn't actually provide anyone with any dignity or sense of autonomy or control. And so there really is a need to kind of have that more coordinated service delivery so that you don't have to force someone to explain how bad they've had it so that they can get a piece of the pie. And so this is where we really struggle, because we know there are specific services that are required for trafficking survivors, but when the whole system is falling apart due to under-resourcing, we don't have a foundation to work from together. I will also never stop saying how nonsensical it is, and we get this all of the time, where we know through research we've conducted that trafficking survivors are being moved across Canada, city to city, to reinforce the dependency on the trafficker, keep them isolated from their friends and family, and to capitalize on greater profits for the trafficker. We still have municipalities that will not serve folks that are homeless because they don't have a home in their jurisdiction. Makes no sense to me that you would actually tell someone that they're not eligible for emergency shelter when they don't have a home in your municipality. That one drives me insane. And then immigration status. The vast majority of sex trafficking survivors are Canadian women and girls, but there are also folks that are without status or with precarious status. And we're also finding that even in cities like Toronto that claim to be sanctuary cities, in practicality, it's not always playing out that way, and it's not how it's existing. So there aren't clear enough firewalls between CBSA and all other basic services that people need to live. Some of the other barriers that we see is around the communal living spaces. So again, really needing that privacy, but also because of the acute experiences of trauma, also having been on completely different schedules. So folks are often sexually exploited and up all night, sleeping all day, being in communal spaces where they're then expected to completely change their sleeping hours and eat 3 meals a day is just not realistic, and it's not trauma-informed. And in many areas too, because there are threats and retaliations similar but also different to other forms of intimate partner violence, sometimes needing secure locations where their traffickers can't find them. And then the operational policies. And I know this can be hard. Sometimes I was chatting too, because some of this stuff is hard to fit into policies. And again, it's why so many trafficking survivors say, I cannot be in a shelter with women and children, right? Our stories are completely different, and I can't promise that I'm gonna fit into that social box. So things like curfews, closures during the day, having nowhere to go, having a whole bunch of conditions on their stay, making them perform a certain way so that they just have a place to be. And then some of the other challenging stuff, to actually kick someone out because they're giving someone attitude. So many people say that they're trauma-informed, but part of that is actually understanding that so many of these behaviors are coming from a place of trauma, and often when people are acting out, it's because they're performing in a way that they wish that they would have been able to when they were actually in that threatening experience. So yes, folks can't beat and harass workers. I know that there are lines on this in terms of how it is you're actually implementing policy. But also, you can't also kick someone out for dropping the F-bomb or telling you to screw off every once in a while, because that has been a survival mechanism, and we need to actually unpack what trauma-informed means. And also forcing people to participate in programs, even if it's completely irrelevant to their interests, well-being, or where they're at, is also a waste of time. So part of our overall advocacy and policy recommendations, I think, also speak to a lot of the stuff that works across the sector, but again, needs to be tailored to individual needs. Too many people also say that they take on a trauma-informed approach without being able to identify what that is or how they're evaluating it and how they're maintaining it. So I do think it would be great to have a better set of guidelines. There's no checkbox with trauma-informed work, but there are certain processes and protocols that are also embedded in anti-oppression and making sure that we're looking in an ongoing way in terms of how we can be more inclusive. Harm reduction is incredibly important to our advocacy and to the folks that we serve. Really placing autonomy and choice at the heart of everything. We are not saviors. We're not here to tell them what to do. We are here to provide options as best we can and to be supportive advocates where other people will not listen to them because of systems of oppression and power. And the need for service coordination. In Peel Region, they actually have a sex trafficking hub and a no wrong door service delivery model to support folks, and it's seen great success. But we need to start replicating best practices for different communities based on individual needs. And okay, I know I'm almost done. So our broad ones are to prioritize housing for trafficking survivors, but also understanding it within the continuum, dedicating more units to trafficking survivors. Again, this is our mandate, providing training for those housing providers and improving collaboration. And that is it for me. I think I'm exactly 20 minutes. Our Twitter handles, our social media handles are incredibly long, but I encourage you to follow us, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, I'm going to invite our presenters back up to the stage, and we can have a Q&A at this time now. We don't have a lot of time. Sorry about that, but I will ask if you have a question to step to the mic in the middle of the room, if you could. If not, we do have a volunteer in the room who can bring the mic to you, but you'll have to just raise your hand. So I'm sure you all have lots of questions, so I'll give you a moment to think about it. Do you have any questions for each other?
Actually, I do have a question for you two about loft, if that's okay.
Do you want to, just for the recording, I know.
So it's someone
Well,
else.
oh, we've got one question from the audience. Okay, thank you,
Check,
sir.
1, 2. My name is James. I work at Native Men's Residence in Toronto. And I had the light bulb come on a couple times in the last presentation. Because there's, we're men's residents, but we're like women too, male Native men and women, okay. Now, as a caseworker, outreach aftercare, I've run into a couple of clients there. Well, one client, I believe she was the building where she was staying was a lot of sex work and stuff like that. But what could I do as a worker that would be able to intervene somehow, with your addictions and stuff like that?
I think the most important thing is just to see the person, show that you care. There's not one intervention route, but to do everything you can as a case manager to connect them through services in a non-judgmental way, but also open the door to access other services and supports based on where they're at. So you can also always call the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-833-900-1010, and we can connect you with other services in the area as well. But I think a big part of it and why folks feel really trapped when they're being exploited is because they're not really being seen and because they're so dismissed as a human being. Like, I don't like pitting systems of oppression against each other, but when you add sex work onto that, there's a real kind of layer of discrimination from general society. Like, you really look down on people, so just being seen and valued and being given options for support. And then, again, you can always reach out to the hotline so that we can connect you with additional supports in your area.
Okay, I think because the other thing happened too is a woman. She was working as a sex worker, and I guess she upset her pimp, and she came to the outreach office looking for support, and we don't really do anything there. So I tried to hook her up with Ondayon or something else like that, but she says it's like what they were saying, the guidelines of the shelter, like with the curfews, they don't fit her lifestyle. She's sleeping in the day and working at night, just the opposite.
So she says pimps are traffickers.
Right.
Right? Like, that's like, it's a different language we're using now, but basically when she's getting in trouble, she's being like threatened that she's going to be beaten if she doesn't hand her money over to someone for providing sexual services. Like, that is trafficking, and that is where specialized services are needed. And they're not always available. Sometimes there are specific beds. Again, the hotline is there, but this is where we're struggling too, is because like we're nothing without our partners, right? And for folks on the ground doing it, like we're not in the business of running hundreds of programs on the ground. It needs to be happening from the community level. So sometimes, did you say you worked for an Indigenous organization?
Yes, and Native men's residents in Toronto.
So there are also like specific Indigenous programs and services in Toronto and outside that we could connect with if that's what they're interested as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but we're happy to connect with you after. It's hard as well because a lot of people think that you can just go in and like save someone, right? And they're like, what do I do to like shift their mind? It's similar to intimate partner violence, right? Like, folks need to be ready to exit, but also the biggest expert of their own safety is the person that's at risk, right? So when they always say like, why didn't she just leave? Well, because she was working with a bunch of circumstances where she might reasonably actually die if she tried to leave at that point. And so we try and work with folks on that level. We also do safety planning and other kind of crisis support. I wouldn't say that we're not the cops, we're not 911. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, I really appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Marshall. I've been chatting with a couple of you folks. So my question is sort of around the first two presentations. Well done on all of yours. It was fantastic to listen to. I am from Victoria, trying to start some sort of a queer housing program there. And I guess like what sort of advice do you have for somebody who's just trying to get something started off the ground?
Yeah, maybe. Sure.
I'd be happy to connect with you after as well, but I really think organizational readiness, so depending on if you're starting kind of your own space or if you're working within an organization, there's got to be buy-in. I think one of the biggest things we found was that this is definitely, it's not just another housing program, it's not something that's going to happen off the side of your desk. It really needs that kind of specialized attention. Because otherwise you're not really listening back to the community, right? And so I think I would say that's the number one thing is making sure you've got kind of that foundation in place and to be prepared for that kind of ongoing learning. And we're constantly changing what we do, right, to be able to serve the folks that we do.
Thank you. I would, please look to the other folks here and folks who are doing this work on the ground. But one specific resource example, if folks haven't seen it, Out Saskatoon, who runs Pride Home, which Anne Marie mentioned is a transitional housing program for queer and trans youth in Saskatoon, and one of the few in the country. They've made like most of their documentation in terms of intake forms, recommendations when hiring and training staff. They have all of this online in a Google folder on Google Drive. That's if you look on their website, they've made a lot of really helpful resources available in terms of like how they did it and how they do it. So would definitely recommend checking that out.
Hi, I had a question for the first two presentations and one for the second. And they're questions that come from a lived experience perspective as someone with lived experience and who has also worked with other folks with lived experience. I noticed the first two presentations pointed out a really important gap, which is around youth that only have access to support around sexual and gender diversity up to a certain age, and often that's really, really low, like 21 or 24 years of age. What I'm wondering is if anyone here has insights on research or knows of research that focuses on adults, young adults or older adults who have never even had that access to those resources as youth. So not so much just that folks are aging out, but also that they never even had that starting point and they're really just starting from scratch. And often knowing that that might affect groups like newcomers, racialized, minority, ethnic communities, people that grew up maybe in rural or suburban areas, people that are focusing on like medical or disability issues, just that kind of different experience and where that kind of sits in the research right now.
Well, thank you for your question, and you can saw my hesitancy coming to the front just because, as you said, like those supports are we can definitely see them less in the community for folks who are adults or young adults, and that's what we're trying to kind of understand with this current project. Although the understanding and the emerging teams are still kind of in process. But we're definitely seeing like emerging, echoing what you just shared in terms of folks who identify as 2SLGBTQ+, who are newcomer, never access those services and have a limited support network around them. And so what we've heard is mostly kind of really relying on those like early connections that they've had through jobs and through their employment, where those kind of really informal supports are really coming at play. So not really kind of a lot to add to this, but we're definitely seeing those kind of those barriers, but also what is emerging in the community. And often I think right now what I'm seeing is that it's through those informal supports and those organizing. And we've heard from one person who was a newcomer, lost their housing. It was someone at work who provided them with a place to stay. So not formalized supports in those cases. So maybe stay tuned with us because those will come in the future. But yeah.
If I can just add to that, actually, I was going to say, I think one thing that's become really evident to us in the practice of it is that folks need that space to first land in to be able to even identify. And that's been a huge piece, I think, at our site, particularly at Spencer, at Loft, is we've seen a lot of folks kind of who are middle-aged or older adults who have not been able to come out as trans until they are in their 40s or 50s. And so particularly where those intersections around culture and race come in, I think it's very difficult to find research because so few people are comfortable identifying right now. And so we want to create more of that safety and more of that community. And so much of what we've seen are people being able to say, like, okay, I'm not the only one experiencing this. Because it's very, very difficult, I find, especially working with this community, to have the research be the first thing and then to follow with practice. And so I'd say in this case, we really need to go the other way around.
Thank you. Yeah, there's definitely a gap in the resources. So I guess looking at filling those gaps before even getting to the research makes sense, and it's important to do. My last question is really quick, and it's for the last presenter, and you may or may not have an answer to this. It's just a gap that I've seen, experienced, and know other folks who have. So we see something that's called often survival sex, and it falls into this kind of random category where it's like people define their own experiences, but oftentimes it's not consensual sex work. And oftentimes it's very repetitive. It's not like a one-time event, but it's also not always commercial where there is money being exchanged. So I'm wondering if folks call your hotline, for instance, is there a service that people get referred to that actually fills that area if it isn't defined within your scope of work, or how do you see that in the world?
Yeah, and we refer to it as circumstantial sex work, but survival sex work as well. I'll say we serve everyone. So we don't do like an intake screening to be like, check, you're a human trafficking survivor, this is where you go. And there's only about 25% of the organizations and programs within our national referral directory that are trafficking specific. So we really do work with generalized services. I'll also say that it's a buzzword. We meet folks where they're at without judgment. So we also know that a lot of folks, when leaving a trafficking situation, will then engage in either independent sex work, survival sex, like circumstantial sex work. It's along a continuum as well. And we do provide services for folks that are also just like looking for services as sex workers, regardless of where they're at. I will say there's a, and for good reason, in some ways, there's a real division between the sex worker rights advocacy movement and the anti-human trafficking movement. And I will say also because the anti-human trafficking movement has been very like white savioristic, law enforcement focused in the past. So I own that as someone who's new to the space, and recognizing that as well. And I think that there's more work that needs to be done to kind of start actually transforming the discourse of what human trafficking is, and to be working more in allyship and partnership along that continuum.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree that there definitely needs to be more definitions, because even the language that I know is common to your sector that you just used, circumstantial sex work, like non-consensual sex, I wouldn't consider to be work. Yeah. So I think that's like even just starting with the terminology is something important.
Yeah, and part of that too, we always talk about like engagement in the commercial sex industry, but it also then depends on where that person is at in terms of their agency, choice, and options. So that is where we really do kind of focus. And in operating the hotline too, we don't use language like I'm using right now. So a big part of trauma-informed practice is actually using the language of the person that you're talking to, right? So they say, my boyfriend's gonna beat me if I don't do X, Y, and Z. We don't say, your trafficker is going to blah, blah. Like, we make sure to use their language and to have a one-on-one conversation.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for our panelists? Thank you so much. This has been a great session, and we're ending on a high note.